Hello and welcome to some comments on the Module 7 workshop for Justice, Ends and Means. Now, this week, as usual, we've got two parts to the workshop. The first part deals with your justice system skills, and the second part deals with your university skills, study skills. So let's start with the first part and the Dangerous Dogs and Other Animals workshop. Now, this is a workshop that puts together everything you've learnt so far and also includes the material from this week on making of rules and bylaws. So it has that one extra level that's included there, and that's the interaction between formal laws and legislation and sets of rules that are created by a delegated authority that is empowered under that legislation. And as I mentioned in the introduction video for the content, this is something that happens more and more these days, and it's something that legal work is more and more concerned with. And it's something that everyday people are more and more concerned with. So it's not necessarily the laws that are passed by Parliament that are affecting people's lives, but it's the bylaws, the regulations, or whatever that other authorities are empowered to make under those laws. So, the classic example is the traffic laws, where there are some very broad top level laws that are made, and then the Parliament delegates power to traffic authorities to make all the rules and guidelines around that. So increasingly, people who are lawyers are being called upon to challenge that delegation of power where it's not done correctly. And increasingly, everyday people and people who are working authorities are having to deal with those issues. It's like, well, the creation of the delegation of power to create rules is not an open slate. There are guidelines as to what you can do with those rules, and quite often authorities step over the line. Okay, so coming back to slotting that into our existing toolkit and understanding how it all fits together. The challenge this week is focusing on a set of laws, hypothetical laws that regulate dangerous dogs, and the sets of rules that have been created by authorities that have been mandated to do it, and then looking at what those laws and rules say, and then looking at the precedents where these have been previously considered by courts to see how that fits in to the interpretation of those rules. So this is pretty much all of the bits and pieces that go into legal process. I mean, what you don't have to do here is filter through all the legal documents to come up with all the principles. You don't have to read hundreds of pages of cases and legislation to find out what the rules and precedents are. And that is a big part of what lawyers do and learning to be a lawyer and everything else. But in terms of the analytical framework, what we've got here this week does cover everything that lawyers do. So, if you're thinking of going on after this to become a lawyer, it's this plus an awful lot of tedious reading and summarizing and trying to sort of sift these principles that I've given you here out of these other documents. But the complexity of the operation of these different ideas is this is it. This is what lawyers do. Okay. The focus here is on uncertainty. And that's one thing to really bear in mind when we're thinking about law is most law operates in zones of certainty and there's no real questions about it. If you get pulled over for speeding, there's not a lot of uncertainty around that, although a physicist would say that the radar that they use to check speeds is grossly inaccurate and all the other things. But if you accept that you were doing 75 kilometers an hour in a 60 zone, then it's all very cut and dried. There's no point in legal challenge. So law operates where things are the unusual cases. So it operates where people thought that the original rules were kind of certain, and they thought this would work, and for some reason, the practical application has meant that the way the rules are written are not quite don't quite work right. So there's an uncertainty there that's to be resolved. It happens where law enforcement bodies and regulators overstep the mark and they start trying to use a set of rules outside their scope and start using it to try and, regulate people who are not supposed to be regulated. And it also happens when people try to exploit um, the uncertainty in a set of rules to try and avoid responsibility and say, well, yeah, that's what the rules are supposed to do, but technically it says this, and therefore there's a sort of a loophole there. So the work of lawyers is only happens where there's this uncertainty, and it only happens, generally speaking, in unusual cases. That being said, it's quite surprising how often things are more uncertain than they seem to be. All right. So in terms of the materials, we've got a series of uh, rules. We've got legal sources. We've got cases. Um, and then we've got, when we look at part B, a series of scenarios that are unusual scenarios. They're edge cases. They're where they're uncertainty. And it requires you to put all these things together and look at how the rules apply. So starting with the rules, and as I said, these are all fictional laws, and I've done that quite deliberately so that you have something very clear to work with. If I gave you actual legal sources, you'd have that difficulty of actually reading, interpreting, and understanding and reducing it to this level. So, this is not real stuff, but it's the way real stuff looks and acts once you go through that process of interpretation. So we've got a rule that says the owner of an animal is guilty of an offence if their animal is present in a public place and is not on a leash or otherwise under effective control. So it seems pretty certain. Um, but we've got questions there about what do some of these words mean. First of which, animal. This is called the Dangerous Dogs Act. Does that limit the word animal to only dogs, or can this involve other dogs as well? These are all open-ended questions, but these are all matters for where lawyers will create an argument that reflects the best interests of the side that they're representing. Public place. Again, it sounds on the face of it to be quite a certain thing, but how would we define what a public place is? And then the question is the question of control. So the first proposition of this law is that a dog should be on a leash. And if it's on a leash, seems to be enough. But it also says or otherwise under effective control. So on the face of it, it seems to say that there are two options here. You can either be on a leash or under effective control. Now, if you're thinking the way hopefully you're starting to think, there's also questions about what if an animal's on a leash and not under effective control? What if the leash is not controlling them for whatever reason? Would that still be fine under the legislation? And on first glance, it would be. Control is only required when there is no leash. So we start out by teasing out some of those uncertainties there and having a look at those specific cases. So we've got questions around a guide dog and a guide dog trainer, and it has a harness and a collar, but not has a dog harness, but not a lead. There's a ruckus caused by another dog. There are no injuries. Does the act apply here? So we've got questions here about, does is the shopping centre a public place? When we're talking about a guide dog, are we talking about an ownership of an animal, or is a guide dog somehow a different legal category? We've got the leash or effective control. Is the harness considered the same as a leash, or is the harness considered a form of effective control? In this situation, the dog also broke free from the trainer's hold. Now, if a dog is on a leash, does it have to be attached to a person at the other end? So interesting uncertainties there. And we'll look in a moment at some of the other sources, how they might help us interpret that um, basic, 2 lines of rules, and how we look at other sources. The second is a cat that's on a golf course, and the question is, a cat an animal under the Act, given that it's the Dangerous Dogs Act? Is a golf course a public place? It's a private club. Does that make it a public place or a private place? However, there's a practice of allowing people to to walk their dogs or to exercise on the course. Does that make it a public place? And there's also the issue of the cat being obedience trained. Is that considered to be under effective control? And the third situation is farmland. There's a music festival, um, and there's a small dog that trips someone over and causes injury. Now, is a dog required to be dangerous? And does dangerous mean that it's a dog that attacks people? Or is tripping someone over considered enough to be dangerous? Also, is the fact that the animal's not a pet that's meant that's livestock on the farm. Does that change the character of the rules? So there's lots of things to think about there in terms of the semantics of how the little rules apply, but this is the way the law works. Law is semantic. It's about arguing these fine points. Now you've got so you've got two um, sources that'll help you out. There's some common law rules from old cases that pre-exist the law. And there's that question of, well, does the law actually replace those common law rules? Or are these rules, or does the new act embrace those rules so we can still refer to those old rules? There's some legislation, and this legislation has been amended over time. So that's something to consider. How did the amendments of the to the legislation change the way it's interpreted? Um, so the section we're looking at is from a 1934 Act, but it's amended in 1962, which would mean that there's a new version of the Act to be interpreted. There are also some regulations that have been created um, using delegated power under the Acts that provide us with help in terms of listing what are considered to be dangerous dogs, listing what's considered to be public places, and listing what is considered to be effective control. So again, there's questions over how we integrate those rules, not made by Parliament, but made under power delegated by Parliament into the way we interpret it. And finally, there are some cases, and in these cases, there are multiple judges, and this brings in the material we looked at earlier in the term around the ways in which majority judgments are formed, and what do you do with a minority judge's perspective. So there's a lot of complex stuff in here. So I'm not expecting, for the purposes of this workshop, for this to be something that you've absolutely mastered every single part of. But I'm hoping that this experience will give you an idea of the broad range of sources that can be drawn in, and where you've got a very simple legal principle. I mean, it's got a lot of uncertainties in it, but it's fairly simple. It's 2 lines. Suddenly, there's all these other materials that you use to draw in to help you understand what it actually means. And as I said at the outcome of the outset of this workshop, um, this is the complexity of what lawyers do. This is the big picture of what the legal job is involved. And if you've up until this point thought that it's like TV, where you stand up and you give an impassioned speech and you say, this, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is just or unjust or whatever. Hopefully this has given you a much better perspective on what legal work is actually about. And I know this is one of the, sources of attrition with law students. There's quite a few people get into law degrees thinking they're going to be doing the TV lawyer stuff. And when they find out the law is actually a very pedantic thing that involves a whole lot of reading, they drop out because then they're not interested. And good for them. If they're not interested, why study something you're not interested in? But so if you are someone who's doing the subject who's thinking, oh, this might be a bridge to studying law, I might be interested, have a think about that. Because if you're the kind of person for whom this attention to detail and this going through and checking boxes and making sure this matches up with this, and someone said this and this refers back to that, if that's part of your skill set and that's something that intrigues you, then you might be well suited to, transfer into law or to go on to study law. Um, but do that with your eyes open, with knowing what's actually involved. Because as I said, there's a whole lot of people who enroll to study law with a completely wrong idea about what's involved and very quickly get disillusioned and drop out. And um, if they do it in time and don't end up paying fees, that's good for them. But we also end up with a lot of people who don't drop out in time and end up paying a bunch of money for something that they're not getting any value out of. All right. So the second part of this workshop I'll just talk about briefly because there's some good video materials attached to this to help you think through the process of writing. But my main message here is to really take the idea of writing seriously and to think about writing as a skill and as a craft that you develop over time. And I think what a lot of us start out with is this idea that writing is just a process of translating ideas onto the page. And writing is just a case of you've got all this information, you've looked it up, you've researched it, whatever. And writing is just this process where you slam it down on the page, type it into the computer so that someone else can read it. And we sometimes think of writing as this sort of neutral process, and that it's just a matter of writing down the stuff uh, in a way that someone else can understand. The truth of the matter is, writing is a very crucial skill academically, analytically, in professional life. And there is a vast difference between someone who just pours everything out on the page and someone who knows how to structure, how to engage a reader, how to provide analysis, and has worked on those skills and honed them. Um, so first things first, if you're a novice, you haven't been doing a lot of writing before, or you haven't been very reflective or self-conscious about the way in which you write, now's a good time to start thinking about that and developing your skills. It makes a massive difference when it comes to marking, the marks that people get. Um, Apart from the fact that this is just good academic work, that we ask you to analyze ideas, and good writing involves analysis, and often as a marker, people will say, well, where did I go wrong? I had all the relevant points here, and the issue is that you didn't analyze it. You just put it on the page. You didn't say anything about it. You didn't explain it. You didn't put your position on it. You didn't apply it to a situation. You didn't assess that idea or that evidence in comparison to another. So all those things are things that come out of good writing. The other thing to consider is that most people who are marking, 100 very similar assignments. They might have, depending on the luck of the draw, you could be at the end of the day when someone has spent all day marking assignments. You want to be able to impress them. You want to be able to draw their attention. You want to be able to make it easy for them to give you those marks. And that's not about being flashy. That's not about like being gimmicky or coming up with a flashy way of doing things, but it's about clarity and it's about good writing. And yeah, it's the most I ever learned about writing. The first time I really started learning about writing was when I started marking other people's work. Uni, I learned nothing about writing. It was just a matter of, well, you just write it down. It's just an automatic thing that you do. Then when I started marking students' work, it was like, oh, okay, this is really important. So one of the things I always recommend to improve your writing is to work with study buddies and to swap your assignments and to go through the process of assessing each other's work. because there's lots of benefits for that. And it's very beneficial for the person for whom you can give feedback. But it's also extremely beneficial for you to be able to look at the topic and go, oh, okay, this is a different way of doing it. Now, is it good? Is it bad? What are the good features? What are the bad features? There's a whole lot of other stuff tied into that. But that process of looking at other people's work is extremely useful. I mean, you can see stuff that just screams when you see it and you just go, oh, that's really bad. But that's something I do all the time. So maybe I shouldn't do that. You can also see good things and you think, well, maybe I should be doing more of those sort of things. So yes, in terms of writing, the practice of writing is really important. And there's a whole lot of things we've said earlier about planning your time that tie into that. If you're only writing up an assignment the night before it's due, you don't have the opportunity to be able to get feedback from someone else. So, of course, you're not giving yourself the chance to learn in that particular way. So, good study habits and being able to engage sincerely with your studies does feed into this, in terms of making space, making time to concentrate on the writing. So anyway, we've got a few sources, a couple of videos. There's a lot more stuff there. And Thomas Frank, for instance, I've referred you to him previously. He's got lots of other advice on study skills and on writing in particular. But the one thing I really want to think for you to take this away, and it's particularly important in the era where people are saying, oh, AI will do all the writing for you. The answer is that AI writes terribly. It may come up with all the sources. In fact, it may come up with new sources that it's just completely made up for itself. But there is very little analysis or good writing that comes out of AI. And part of the problem with that is it's all it's doing is modeling stuff. It's just copying stuff it already has. And AI is actually getting worse because it's just copying other AI generated things. So there is that question of, people say, well, is it a fail? Is it considered plagiarism if I use an AI to write an assignment? Well, it's dishonest to do it if you're not putting anything in there yourself. But also, at some level, it doesn't matter because quite often the material that is produced by an AI is just a series of non sequiturs. And it's still, even if you passed with it, still not very good. And at the end of the day, you've got to think about what are you doing with your study if you're just trying to get through, and if you're not actually taking the time to learn and develop skills. I know it's easy for me to say who's at the other end of the process, but you do pay a lot of money for the study experience. And if you're just sort of finding the quickest, easiest way to sort of, you know, cheat your way through it, you are depriving yourself of an opportunity to learn. And that does come back and bite you in professional life when people say, well, you've got a degree, we expect you to be able to write. And suddenly you hit things that you can't use an AI to write. And or if you do use an AI to write, its quality is really poor. It's not analytical. It's not really focused on the topic, and it's not really useful. So anyway, I don't want it to sound like I'm just lecturing at you and telling you what to do, but I do want you to think about taking that process of writing seriously and looking at ways of improving as you go because it makes a huge difference to your grades.